The moment she touched the cold earth, she felt it, the weight of a secret older than memory, heavier than grief, a pulse that did not belong to the living and yet refused to be silenced by death. She had been warned not to come here, not to disturb what lay beneath the moss stones and tangled roots, but curiosity, sharper than fear, had driven her. The grave had been unmarked, hidden at the edge of the forest where sunlight hesitated, where shadows lingered like silent watchers. Her hands sank into the soil, wet, heavy, almost alive, and for a fleeting second, she felt a presence stir beneath her fingertips. It was subtle, almost polite in its warning, but unmistakable. Something beneath the surface breathed. She froze, her pulse surging with the recognition of impossibility. The air itself seemed to tighten around her, thickening, pressing against her lungs, and the wind whispered as if carrying fragments of forbidden knowledge, secrets that had been buried intentionally, to protect the living from what lay beneath. As her fingers brushed against the edge of the coffin, splintered and decayed, the realization hit her with a force that left her trembling. The man who had been entombed here, supposed to be nothing more than soil and shadow, had survived in some form. Not fully alive, yet not dead. The distinction mattered little. Time had become irrelevant. What existed now was something suspended between worlds, something patient, intelligent, and aware. Every rational thought she had tried to cling to fled before the enormity of what she had unearthed. She was staring into a truth so dangerous that centuries had conspired to hide it, a darkness too profound for ordinary minds to process. And in that silence, heavy with the scent of earth and iron, she understood that her life, her perception of reality, had irrevocably shifted. She had stepped across a line drawn in blood and fear, into a realm where death itself was negotiable, where the boundaries between the living and the forbidden had been erased. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble in anticipation, as if acknowledging her initiation into this grim, hidden order, and the air around her seemed to pulse with the echo of every secret the world had tried to bury. She realized then that curiosity was not just dangerous, it was transformative, and there was no going back. She pried at the coffin with trembling hands, each movement deliberate, yet haunted by the dread that she was disturbing forces older than kingdoms, older than gods. The wood cracked beneath her fingers, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the hollow silence, like the world itself exhaling in warning. And then she saw it, the faint movement, almost imperceptible, a shift beneath the rotting lid. Her mind screamed impossibility, but the evidence was undeniable. Something inside still breathed. Her rational thoughts collided violently with instinct, and instinct won. The air grew heavier, charged with a subtle electricity, as though the very soil beneath her feet were alive and aware, responding to the disturbance. The smell of decay mingled with an almost metallic tang, sharp and clinging to her nostrils, pulling her deeper into the macabre intimacy of the grave. She felt eyes, if they could be called eyes, watching her, calculating, measuring, recognizing her presence. The notion of death, as humanity had understood it, shattered completely. Her heart pounded. But it was not fear alone. It was recognition, a primal acknowledgement that some truths were never meant to surface. What she was witnessing had been hidden, carefully erased from history, yet preserved here with meticulous intent. Institutions had buried more than bodies. They had buried knowledge, control, and secrets that challenged the very foundations of human understanding. She understood then that the man in the grave was not an anomaly. He was a vessel, a container of forbidden knowledge, a living repository of truths the powerful feared. As her fingers brushed the splintered wood again, she felt a subtle recoil, as if whatever lay within were aware of her probing, assessing whether she was worthy, or merely another intruder to be silenced. Every story she had been told about mortality, about the finality of endings, collapsed into a single, undeniable reality. Death was negotiable, manipulated by those who understood its true nature. And yet, there was something else, something almost imperceptible but insistent, a rhythm, a whisper of purpose. It was a message embedded in the very act of survival, a warning and an invitation. Whoever had orchestrated this burial had left behind a challenge. Not all knowledge could be contained. Not all power could be restrained. And now, she was part of it. The line between curiosity and obsession blurred, as she realized that she was being drawn into a system far larger, older, and more intelligent than any society she had known. Each breath she took was heavy with the knowledge that she had crossed into territory where normal rules did not apply, where institutional control, ancient corruption, and suppressed truths intertwined, and where her own understanding of reality would be tested, warped, and ultimately transformed. The descent had begun, and there was no retreat, no turning back, only the path deeper into the dark. The lid gave way with a final, mournful crack, and a wave of cold air escaped, carrying with it a whisper of something ancient, deliberate, and alive. She hesitated for only a moment before peering inside, and what she saw defied every law she had ever trusted. The man, or what remained of him, was not lifeless, not entirely. His eyes, dull at first, flickered with an intelligence that sent shivers down her spine. It was not human, not fully, and yet it understood her. It recognized the trespass, and in that recognition, a strange invitation manifested, subtle but undeniable, a beckoning to witness, to understand, to become part of a secret the world had buried with its deepest fears. She leaned closer, the metallic tang of blood and decay thick in her mouth, the scent almost intoxicating in its power to command attention. Each breath she drew seemed to synchronize with the faint, irregular pulse beneath the corpse's chest, and in that rhythm, she could feel the weight of centuries, the pressure of knowledge kept from mankind, truths too dangerous to survive daylight. The burial had been a safeguard, a warning, a system of containment for forces too cunning to be ignored. Yet here it was, breathing quietly, waiting. She realized that this man had been chosen, not for death, but for endurance, as if the world's architects had intended for him to remain, a living testament to what humanity could not yet comprehend. And in that realization, the darkness around her thickened, no longer just the shadows of trees and ice, but a suffocating presence of design, manipulation, and control. The more she gazed, the more she understood that this was not a singular anomaly, but a reflection of a system hidden in plain sight, a network of influence, secrecy, and ancient intent that governed the world quietly, invisibly, and with absolute precision. Every instinct screamed to flee, but curiosity, now fused with recognition of forbidden truth, held her fast. She knew that witnessing this was more than discovery. It was initiation. The veil had been lifted, and she could never unsee what she had seen. The soil, the air, the decayed wood, all were conduits of knowledge, whispers of a reality constructed to obscure the power of those who dared to manipulate life and death alike. Each second she lingered, each heartbeat she stole from fear and fascination, pulled her deeper into the rabbit hole, further from the comfort of ignorance, and closer to truths that could change the way she understood not just death, but control, corruption, and the hidden forces that shaped every moment of human history. She could feel it now, a presence that extended beyond the coffin, seeping into the very air around her, connecting her to a lineage of secrets carefully concealed for centuries. This was not merely a man, but a node in a network of hidden agendas, ancient corruption, and power structures so old they had shaped empires from the shadows. Every movement he made was deliberate, calculated, a silent communication meant only for those capable of understanding the language of suppressed truths. She realized that his survival had been orchestrated, maintained by systems invisible yet omnipresent, designed to ensure that certain knowledge remained both tantalizingly close and utterly unreachable. The mind reels at such complexity, but she could feel it insinuating itself into her own consciousness, a creeping awareness that understanding the truth required sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to see the world as it truly was, a stage manipulated by forces that thrived on ignorance, control, and fear. And fear, she now understood, was never incidental. It was the instrument, the mechanism by which obedience was maintained and power preserved. Each breath she drew was heavy with realization. The institutions, the legends, the histories taught in schools, were curated, edited, and twisted, all to prevent men like her, or her, from glimpsing the machinery of control. She touched the man again, and for the first time, she felt a faint warmth, as though life itself had been preserved by intention, by intelligence, and by a desire to ensure the truth would eventually be revealed. But revelation came at a cost. She could feel her thoughts stretching, reshaping, breaking against the walls of conventional reality, each crack a doorway to comprehension of manipulation so deep that it reshaped loyalty, morality, and perception itself. It was a power older than nations, older than religion, hidden behind rituals, laws, and the smoke of fabricated stories. And as she stared, The line between observer and participant dissolved. The knowledge was not passive. It demanded engagement, demanded recognition, demanded that she confront not just what had been buried, but what had been imposed upon every living mind for centuries. Every instinct screamed caution, every rational thought urged retreat, but the gravity of forbidden awareness was irresistible. She had become complicit in the very system designed to test the boundaries of human curiosity and endurance, and with that complicity came an irreversible transformation, a slow, consuming awakening to the magnitude of corruption, control, and the dangerous truths that the world had buried beneath centuries of silence. She leaned closer, and the air seemed to vibrate with a resonance older than memory, as if the soil itself remembered every secret ever buried, every lie ever propagated to maintain control over the living. The man's eyes, dim yet piercing, held a message she could not yet fully decipher, but she felt it penetrate her mind like a cold, deliberate hand, nudging her into comprehension. He was a guardian of truths suppressed by kings, priests, and secretive councils that had long since abandoned morality for influence. Each breath, each subtle twitch, was a code, a cipher meant for the initiated, and with every second she observed, she felt the weight of an invisible hierarchy pressing down upon her understanding. She realized that what she held in her hands, what she had dared to unearth, was not an anomaly, but a fragment of a global apparatus of control, a living testament to the lengths humanity's architects would go to shape perception, loyalty, and obedience. And it was terrifying. Knowledge, she now understood, was the true weapon, wielded with precision across generations, buried beneath rituals, law, and fear, all to maintain a reality that served the few while enslaving the many. Her heartbeat accelerated, synchronizing with the subtle rhythm emanating from the man beneath her fingers, as though the pulse of suppressed power had chosen her as its witness. The revelation was immediate and visceral. Nothing in the world operated as it appeared, not politics, not history, not even death itself. Every system, every institution, was a mechanism of psychological shaping, calibrated over centuries to guide thought, emotion, and behavior toward compliance. She felt herself being drawn further, deeper into an understanding so vast it could break the mind of the unprepared. And yet, she could not look away. Curiosity had become necessity, comprehension had become survival, and the faint warmth emanating from the coffin was no longer simply life. It was an invitation, a challenge to grasp truths that would change her perception of humanity, morality, and power forever. She understood, finally, that this was not a simple encounter with death. It was an induction into the machinery of influence, a confrontation with forces that had dictated the course of civilizations without ever being named, recognized, or resisted. And in that moment, the forest around her seemed to fade, leaving only the soil, the coffin, and the unmistakable certainty that what she had uncovered would transform her from a passive observer into a participant in a hidden war that had raged silently for millennia. As her hands lingered over the coffin, she felt the layers of time pressing down upon her, centuries of concealment, lies, and ritualized manipulation that had kept the living blind to forces they were never meant to confront. She sensed the fingerprints of empires long fallen, the shadows of kings and priests who had sacrificed morality for dominion, weaving a web of control that stretched from the forgotten temples of Babylon to the darkened corridors of European monarchies. This was not random corruption, it was a deliberate design, a pattern etched into human history, where knowledge was fragmented and buried, only ever revealed in cryptic fragments to those daring enough to pursue it. The man beneath her fingers, preserved against natural law, was a relic of that pattern, a conduit through which the forgotten and forbidden whispered across time. She realized that hidden agendas had always existed, intertwined with myths, religions, and secret societies, all structured to manipulate belief and obedience, to train entire populations to serve without understanding the machinery of their subjugation. And now, she was staring directly at one of the few remaining witnesses, a living archive of truths too dangerous to be revealed openly. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Every story she had been told about heroism, morality, and justice was curated, filtered, and corrupted to reinforce control, to make obedience seem natural, inevitable. History itself was a weapon, wielded with surgical precision, shaping perceptions and behaviors across generations, concealing the true architects of civilization behind layers of ritual, law, and manufactured morality. She felt herself being pulled further, deeper into an awareness that threatened to fracture her sense of reality. The pulse beneath her fingers was not merely life. It was the heartbeat of a system that had endured for millennia, a system that manipulated the human mind, bending psychology, culture, and memory to its will. Every instinct warned her to retreat, yet every moment she lingered, every revelation that brushed her consciousness, demanded more. She saw the continuum of secrecy, the invisible hierarchies that had orchestrated the rise and fall of societies, and the cruel beauty of its design was undeniable. This man, this preserved anomaly, was the key, a direct connection to a truth humanity had been shielded from, that control over perception, power, and life itself had always been exercised by those willing to embrace the darkness, and that knowledge, the kind she was now tasting, was more lethal than any sword or army. She inhaled sharply, feeling the enormity of her discovery pressing against her mind, aware that the descent had only just begun, that the shadows of history were alive, and that she had stepped irrevocably into their dominion. She felt the weight of centuries pressing against her consciousness, the subtle influence of minds long dead but still shaping the living. This was not merely a man preserved against death. It was a node in a system of control so sophisticated, so ancient, that it had gone unnoticed for millennia. Every ritual, every story, every moral lesson had been designed to condition thought, to train obedience, to embed psychological frameworks that guided behavior without the individual ever realizing it. She realized that the human mind itself had become both battlefield and instrument, shaped through fear, belief, and repetition, carefully sculpted by forces that understood the hidden mechanics of consciousness. The pulse beneath her fingers was a reminder that life, death, and awareness were not as separate as they had been taught. The boundaries had always been malleable, bent by those who dared to manipulate both the physical and mental realms. As she stared into those eyes, alive yet alien, she could feel the resonance of intelligence that had survived hidden for centuries, carrying with it lessons, warnings, and strategies that no textbook could convey. This was knowledge of control, of hierarchy, of influence so absolute it could dictate the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The air around her seemed to thicken, vibrating with the echo of systems of authority that had remained invisible because they were designed to be unnoticed. She understood then that obedience had never been accidental. It had been engineered, instilled through faith, ritual, and storytelling, each generation unknowingly rehearsing their subjugation. The man beneath the soil was living proof that these mechanisms were not theoretical. They were active, enduring, and capable of survival even when their human carriers had perished. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine as awareness settled in. She had been given a glimpse not only of forbidden life, but of the architecture of compliance itself, the hidden scaffolding upon which power had been maintained for millennia. Her rational mind recoiled at the implications, but the deeper part of her, the part that had brought her here, understood that this was initiation. To witness was to begin transformation, to comprehend the methods by which elites, ancient and modern, had dominated perception and behavior. The pulse beneath her hands was now a rhythm she could not ignore, a cadence of understanding that demanded she descend further, to see, to grasp, to internalize the mechanisms that shaped the world, invisible but omnipotent. The forest, the earth, the coffin, all were conduits, whispering truths that had been deliberately hidden, and she felt the inexorable pull of knowledge that demanded mastery, awareness, and surrender to the forbidden. She could feel the threads of power stretching through time, invisible yet tangible, linking the man beneath her fingers to a network of corruption so old it had outlasted dynasties and religions alike. This was no accident, no random act of preservation. It was deliberate, a preservation of influence, a living archive of knowledge that had been hidden behind layers of secrecy, ritual, and faith. Secret societies, whispered about in myths and legends, were not simply conspiracies. They were mechanisms, laboratories of control, institutions designed to manipulate perception, to bend morality, and to shape civilizations from behind a veil. She realized that the pulse she felt was the heartbeat of that very machinery, a survival of intelligence meant to endure beyond the reach of those who thought themselves in power. Every dynasty, every throne, every empire had been touched by forces like this, subtle and unseen, orchestrating obedience, suppressing truths, and ensuring that certain knowledge remained unattainable. And now, she was privy to a fragment of it, a living fragment, a witness to the ways history had been curated to hide the extent of manipulation. As she peered closer, The faint movements beneath the coffin seemed purposeful, as if the man, or what he had become, was aware not only of her presence, but of the centuries of orchestration that had led to this moment. The realization hit her with visceral force. The systems of control were alive, enduring, and adaptive, capable of shaping entire generations without revealing themselves. Faith, obedience, myth, and law had all been carefully blended to guide humanity toward submission, while preserving the secrecy of those who held true knowledge. She felt a shiver pass through her, a mixture of awe and terror, knowing that what she had unearthed was not just a relic, but a node, a living testament to the continuity of influence and the lengths to which the hidden architects of society would go to maintain control. Each heartbeat beneath her hands resonated with lessons of manipulation, hierarchy, and survival, carrying whispers of ancient wisdom intertwined with modern domination. And as the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the awakening she had initiated, she understood the magnitude of the descent she had entered. She was no longer merely uncovering a secret. She was becoming part of it, entwined in a legacy of hidden power, compelled to see, to understand, and ultimately, to confront the truths the world had long buried beneath obedience, fear, and silence. She felt her mind bending, folding under the weight of what she had uncovered, as if the very act of observation had activated dormant circuits of comprehension that civilization had been trained to ignore. Every rational structure she had relied upon, the stories, the laws, the morality of her upbringing, crumbled in the face of what was real, what had been deliberately preserved and hidden. The man beneath the soil was no longer just a corpse. He was a mirror, reflecting the manipulation, the hierarchies, and the psychological engineering that had been shaping human thought for millennia. She sensed the careful orchestration embedded in ritual, religion, and societal law, the deliberate conditioning of fear and obedience, all to keep humanity docile, unaware, and compliant. And now, standing over this preserved anomaly, she understood the true scale of the deception. The institutions that seemed to serve the people had long since been instruments of subtle control, wielding psychology as a weapon, invisibly guiding belief and behavior to maintain the supremacy of the few. Her heart raced, her breath caught, as she realized that the pulse beneath her fingers was not just life, it was a key, a code, a beacon of hidden knowledge that demanded she reconcile her perception with reality. The darkness surrounding her was no longer external, it was internal, a deepening awareness of the structures of power operating in plain sight, shaping the thoughts of entire populations while remaining invisible to the unaware. And in that darkness, she understood something more terrifying. Comprehension itself could be dangerous. Knowledge carried consequences, and once she grasped the magnitude of manipulation, once she felt the pulse of ancient control, she could never return to ignorance. Her vision sharpened, the air thickened, and the subtle movements beneath the coffin became a rhythm she could almost hear, almost understand, as if the very intelligence preserved within was communicating the depth of human deception. The realization was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She had been inducted into awareness, initiated by the living remnant of a secret older than history itself. Fear was no longer the dominator. It was the lesson, the tool, the vehicle that had delivered her to the threshold of understanding. And she understood, with clarity that burned in her chest, that to look away now was impossible. The descent had begun, and there was no returning to the comfortable illusions of the unawakened mind. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she could see the subtle intricacies of the preservation, the unnatural alignment of the man's form as though he had been prepared, maintained, and protected against decay with knowledge that defied science. This was no ordinary grave, no simple burial. It was a containment, a laboratory, a temple of secrets designed to survive the erosion of time and human ignorance. She understood, with a clarity that sent shivers down her spine, that this was the work of those who had mastered death and hidden it in plain sight, a synthesis of ritual, alchemy, and forbidden knowledge passed down through clandestine networks of power. The pulse beneath her hands was testament to techniques deliberately obscured, methods taught only to the initiated, ensuring that certain individuals, repositories of knowledge too dangerous to vanish, could endure, silently observing, silently influencing, across centuries. The weight of this realization was suffocating. Every empire she had studied, every religious dogma, every social structure, was intertwined with these hidden practices, calibrated to maintain hierarchy and secrecy. She felt the intelligence within the coffin, subtle but undeniable, as though it knew she had comprehended its purpose, its survival, and its significance. Life and death were not absolutes here. They were tools, manipulated by those with the knowledge and patience to bend reality itself. And as the air grew heavier with the presence of this preserved consciousness, she realized the magnitude of what had been entrusted to the few, the ability to shape perception, manipulate legacy, and maintain dominion long after the world believed it had forgotten. Each heartbeat beneath her fingers resonated with centuries of hidden agendas, secrets of institutions and elite circles that had long orchestrated obedience and suppressed insight. The very act of survival had been a calculated statement, a bridge between ancient corruption and modern power, a message that knowledge, once earned, must be protected, preserved, and perpetuated, even if it meant defying the natural order. She shivered, knowing that she had glimpsed not just forbidden life, but the mechanics of control itself, the coded language of power that had sustained civilizations and manipulated perception from behind the veil. And with that understanding came a singular, irrevocable truth. She had been drawn into a system far larger than herself, one that demanded vigilance, comprehension, and the courage to confront realities that most would never survive, knowing she could feel the weight of countless lives pressing down through time, a silent ledger of sacrifice and manipulation, each name erased, each story buried alongside the truths that had been deliberately obscured. The preservation of this man, this anomaly, was not without cost. She sensed it in the air, in the subtle vibrations beneath her fingers, a residue of devotion, fear, and calculated selection. Those who had endured, those who had been chosen to contain knowledge, were never random. They had been carefully selected, molded, and prepared by elites who understood that wisdom without control was chaos. She realized that this preservation, this unnaturally sustained life, was part of a larger agenda, one that prioritized the accumulation and protection of power above all else, even morality, even human dignity. Entire generations had been guided, coerced, or sacrificed, all to maintain a system where information flowed selectively, where obedience could be predicted, and where rebellion was anticipated and contained before it could threaten the hierarchy. And now, she was standing in the epicenter of that legacy, feeling the weight of every calculated choice, every act of suppression, every lie layered atop another, like sediment in the soil surrounding the coffin. The pulse beneath her hands was more than life. It was testament, witness, and message, carrying with it the intelligence and cunning of those who had orchestrated secrecy for centuries. She could feel the echo of ancient rituals, the meticulous preservation of knowledge that required both devotion and terror, and the inescapable understanding that the world outside this forest had been manipulated from inception, shaped to produce compliance and ignorance. Every heartbeat reminded her that power demanded sacrifice, that control was maintained not merely through law or wealth, but through the careful shaping of consciousness itself. And as she knelt there, she understood something deeper, darker. The true currency of these elites was knowledge, and knowledge required guardians, sometimes living, sometimes hidden, and sometimes, like the man before her, suspended between life and death to serve a purpose that few would ever comprehend. The cost of their secret, of this endurance, was humanity itself, manipulated, controlled, and guided to remain blind while the architects of history quietly dictated the flow of events, preserving their dominion in silence. And in that moment, she realized she was no longer a mere observer. She had been inducted, whether she wished it or not, into a lineage of forbidden awareness, compelled to understand the machinery of power, to witness its human cost, and to confront truths that would alter her perception of life, death, and authority forever. She could feel the boundaries of her mind shifting, subtle at first, like the tide creeping over a shore, then with increasing intensity, reshaping thought, perception, and instinct. The man beneath her hands was no longer passive. His presence reverberated through her consciousness, awakening patterns she hadn't known existed, revealing the invisible architecture of control that had governed her life long before she even realized it. The lessons embedded in ritual, law, history, and religion became suddenly coherent, threads connecting centuries of manipulation, fear, and obedience into a design so precise it was terrifying in its elegance. She recognized, with a chill crawling up her spine, that her very instincts had been conditioned to accept the world as it appeared, to defer to authority, to ignore the subtle levers that guided behavior, while the powerful quietly reshaped societies with impunity. And now, that conditioning was being unraveled in real time, replaced by an acute awareness of the forces operating just beyond perception, forces that could bend reality, influence thought, and preserve control across generations. She could feel her own mind expanding, absorbing patterns, deciphering rhythms, and sensing hierarchies she had never consciously noticed. Every pulse beneath her fingers, every faint breath, every imperceptible movement became a lesson in survival, power, and the architecture of dominance. And as comprehension deepened, a strange exhilaration mingled with fear. Knowledge was intoxicating, but dangerous. She realized that understanding these systems was not enough. She had to integrate them, to internalize the awareness, or risk being overwhelmed, consumed by the magnitude of the truths she had uncovered. The forest around her seemed to recede, replaced by a mental landscape of codes, hierarchies, and influence, each layer whispering secrets about control, manipulation, and hidden agendas that humanity had been trained to ignore. And in that suspended moment, she understood something critical. Awareness itself was a weapon, and once wielded, it changed the wielder irrevocably. Her decisions, her perceptions, even her morality, were now subject to the currents of knowledge she had activated. She could no longer be the person she had been. Her mind had been initiated, and the pulse beneath her hands was the teacher, the key, the reminder that power, once understood, demanded action, mastery, and a confrontation with every hidden force that had been shaping her world. Without her consent, her awareness sharpened into something almost painful, an unrelenting clarity that stripped away every illusion she had clung to, leaving her exposed to the machinery of power that had silently shaped the world for millennia. She could feel it now, not as a concept, but as a force, a lattice of influence and manipulation, ancient and enduring, stretching across empires, religions, and dynasties, all interconnected through secrecy, obedience, and the deliberate control of knowledge. The man beneath her hands was no longer merely preserved life. He was the embodiment of that system, a living archive of corruption, cunning, and calculated survival. And in him, she could trace the fingerprints of elites who had perfected the art of dominance, ensuring that history, law, and ritual served the few while keeping the many compliant, distracted, and blind. Her mind reeled at the enormity of it, at the understanding that every institution she had ever trusted, every government, every church, every academy, was not neutral, not benign, but part of a deliberate orchestration of perception. The pulse beneath her fingers was a rhythm of revelation, each beat resonating with the subtle violence of control, the psychological warfare that had been waged silently on humanity for centuries. She felt a shiver of both terror and awe, realizing that knowledge was not passive. It was a force, a weapon, and a responsibility, and she had been thrust into its current without choice. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every fiber of her being was drawn deeper, compelled by the understanding that ignorance was no longer an option, that comprehension demanded engagement, mastery, and the willingness to confront truths that could destabilize everything she had believed about life, death, and morality. The forest seemed to lean in, holding its breath, as though acknowledging the magnitude of her initiation. And in that moment, she understood with grim precision. She was no longer merely witnessing corruption. She was entwined with it, implicated in its continuity, and granted the rare, dangerous privilege of seeing the forces that had guided civilization in the shadows. Fear had evolved into purpose. Knowledge had become both sword and shield, and the descent into understanding, once begun, could not be halted. Every heartbeat beneath her hands, every subtle shift in the soil, every whisper of the ancient presence demanded she continue, deeper and deeper, into a reality humanity had been trained to ignore, a reality of manipulation, survival, and power that was now hers to navigate, understand, and, ultimately, master. She felt the patterns of ritual unfolding around her, invisible yet palpable, as though the very air carried echoes of ceremonies conducted in secret, shaping minds, souls, and destinies. For centuries, the man beneath her hands was more than preserved life. He was a nexus, a repository of knowledge embedded in ritual, ceremony, and discipline designed to manipulate, control, and endure. She sensed the methods of elites, long concealed, that had transformed ordinary obedience into absolute devotion, using fear, repetition, and symbolism to mold perception without detection. Each heartbeat beneath her fingertips seemed to carry instructions, lessons embedded across generations, strategies for dominance, techniques for subjugation, all maintained in secret because the consequences of exposure would unseat empires. She realized that these rituals were not mere superstition. They were instruments of power, precise tools to train thought, condition loyalty, and maintain hierarchy. Every empire, every religion, every institution she had trusted had been shaped, consciously or unconsciously, by the principles she now glimpsed in this preserved anomaly. The intelligence beneath the soil pulsed in subtle rhythm with her own, as if guiding her to perceive the layers of manipulation hidden in plain sight. The way law, morality, education, and belief had all been calibrated to ensure compliance while concealing the mechanisms of control. And in that realization, she felt the full magnitude of human engineering, lives sacrificed, stories rewritten, knowledge obscured, all to perpetuate systems designed to maintain dominance. Fear, she understood, was never incidental. It was a precise instrument, a lever used to direct action, perception, and allegiance. And now, she was inside it, feeling it work not on the many, but on her, the observer, the witness, the newly initiated. Every instinct that had once guided her was now a part of the lesson, and she understood that this was more than discovery. It was indoctrination into awareness itself. The pulse, the breath, the subtle movements beneath the coffin became a tutor, a guide, a reminder that knowledge was dangerous, that understanding the machinery of control carried consequences, and that once she absorbed these truths, her life would never again be shaped by ignorance. The descent was not a choice. It was inevitable, a journey into the architecture of manipulation, the codified rituals of elites, and the psychological levers that had quietly ruled humanity since time immemorial. And in that moment, she understood that to step away now would be to abandon awareness, to continue was to embrace the transformation, to begin mastering the very forces that had long dominated the unsuspecting. The pulse beneath her hand seemed to thrum with purpose, as if acknowledging that she had arrived at a threshold, one that required not just observation, but action. She realized that awareness alone was insufficient. To truly internalize the forbidden knowledge, she needed to participate, to declare her alignment with the truths she had unearthed, and to commit herself to the descent fully. The air thickened, vibrating with the weight of centuries of manipulation and hidden wisdom, and in that charged stillness, she heard it, a voice, subtle yet commanding, urging her to speak a phrase, symbolic and transformative, a key to lock in understanding and identity. It was simple, yet potent, a verbal talisman bridging perception and consciousness. She repeated it softly, once, feeling the words resonate through her chest, staring a recognition deep in the mind that the world she had known was no longer her framework. Then she spoke it again, louder this time, letting the syllables ripple through the forest, embedding themselves in the pulse she felt beneath the soil, syncing her own rhythm with the preserved life, with the hidden systems of control, with the secret architectures of power that had endured for millennia. As the words echoed, she felt a shift, subtle yet undeniable, a reconfiguration of thought and perception, as if layers of conditioning were being peeled away, revealing the raw machinery of influence, manipulation, and hierarchy. She understood that the repetition was not ceremonial, it was functional, a trigger to activate engagement, attention, and alignment with knowledge that had been intentionally hidden. And in that activation, she could feel the transformation. Fear sharpened into insight, confusion crystallized into clarity, and passive awareness transmuted into active comprehension. The pulse beneath her hands now seemed to answer, responsive and alive, acknowledging her initiation into a continuum of hidden power, signaling that she had crossed from observer to participant, from unawakened to initiated. Every instinct aligned with this new awareness, each thought resonating with the understanding that the descent could not be revised, and that knowledge, once internalized, demanded mastery, vigilance, and engagement. And in that charged silence, she realized the gravity of the act. By speaking the phrase, she had not merely recognized forbidden truths, she had aligned herself with them, integrating the hidden wisdom, and stepping fully into a reality shaped by ancient control, elite influence, and enduring corruption, where perception, power, and survival were inseparable. The moment the phrase left her lips a second time, she felt a subtle shift ripple through her consciousness, as though a hidden mechanism had been activated, rewiring her perception from the inside out. The forest, the soil, the coffin, all of it seemed to pulse with recognition, acknowledging her initiation, her willingness to step into knowledge no ordinary human was meant to grasp. She realized, with a creeping unease, that the world she had known was merely a curated stage, and that every institution, every law, every moral precept had been crafted to channel behavior, to preserve hierarchy, and to conceal the forces that truly governed life and death. The pulse beneath her hands was no longer just life. It was intelligence, awareness, and a reminder that control was never passive. It was active, deliberate, and enduring. Every thought, every instinct she had relied upon was now illuminated, exposing the subtle manipulations embedded in culture, religion, and governance, showing how obedience had been cultivated over centuries, even millennia, to protect those who understood the machinery of power. And with this awareness came a profound and terrifying clarity. She could never again engage with the world in ignorance, never again accept surface truths, for she had been awakened to the hidden scaffolding of influence and corruption. Her senses sharpened, attuned to the subtlest signals, the faintest shifts in intention and perception, as though the pulse beneath her hands had become a teacher, a guide through a labyrinth of secrets, lies, and manipulations designed to dominate the human mind. Fear no longer dominated her consciousness. It had been transformed into vigilance, comprehension, and the unyielding drive to understand the hidden orders of the world. She felt an almost electric connection to the preserved life beneath her fingers, a tether linking her awareness to the continuum of forbidden knowledge that had endured in secret for centuries. Every heartbeat was a lesson, every breath a reminder of the human cost of ignorance, and every subtle movement a challenge. To see, to understand, and to integrate truths that could alter not only perception, but identity itself. She understood now that initiation was not symbolic. It was functional, irreversible, and total. By speaking the phrase, she had bound herself to a continuum of power and knowledge, a lineage of control that demanded mastery, endurance, and the courage to confront corruption wherever it hid, unseen yet omnipresent. In plain sight and behind the veil of history, she felt the structures of civilization unravel before her eyes, not physically, but in perception, as if a curtain had been lifted to reveal the scaffolding of influence, hierarchy, and manipulation that governed every aspect of human existence. The pulse beneath her hands had become a lens, sharpening her awareness of the invisible hands that had guided empires, controlled belief systems, and orchestrated obedience for centuries. She could see the threads connecting kings to priests, merchants to generals, all meticulously aligned to maintain power while concealing the instruments of domination from the uninitiated. History, law, and morality, once comforting and familiar, now appeared as tools, precisely engineered to shape perception, manipulate loyalty, and suppress dangerous knowledge. The preserved life beneath her fingers seemed to embody centuries of strategic intelligence, a living record of the methods by which elites maintained dominance, subtly calibrating fear, desire, and belief to bend populations toward compliance. She realized with chilling clarity that human institutions were never neutral, never accidental. They were active instruments of control, reinforced through ritual, education, and systemic manipulation, with life and death themselves harnessed as mechanisms of obedience. And as she absorbed this awareness, she sensed a deeper pattern. Every culture, every social order, every political structure was a node in a vast network of influence, a continuum maintained by elites who understood the hidden psychology of men. Fear, ritual, and indoctrination were deployed with surgical precision, and knowledge was preserved only in fragments, passed selectively to those deemed capable of handling its weight. The forest around us seemed to pulse with the resonance of these revelations, as if the very land remembered the intricate designs of power and the sacrifices required to sustain them. Every heartbeat she felt beneath her hands reinforced the truth. She had been initiated into perception, irrevocably, and there was no returning to ignorance. The man beneath the soil was both teacher and mirror, revealing the continuum of manipulation and the consequences of awakening. Her mind, once bounded by ordinary comprehension, now stretched across centuries of secrecy, aware of the invisible hierarchies shaping existence. And she understood the stark reality: knowledge carried power, but also responsibility. She had crossed a threshold, and the world would never appear the same. She would see the hidden levers, the orchestrated obedience, and the subtle violence of control everywhere she turned. She felt the full weight of what she had uncovered pressing into her mind, a relentless gravity that reshaped thought, emotion, and perception simultaneously. The pulse beneath her hands was no longer merely a signal of life. It was a conduit of awareness, a living vector of knowledge, of power, of secrets that had been carefully hidden from the masses. Every instinct she had relied on now seemed naive. Every principle she had believed in incomplete. And yet a fierce clarity emerged from the chaos, cutting through confusion like a blade. She realized that understanding the machinery of influence was not enough. Comprehension demanded transformation. The world she had known, bound by rules, morality, and perception carefully curated for obedience, was gone. In its place was a landscape of hidden hierarchies, rituals, and subtle manipulations that stretched across centuries, weaving fear, desire, and allegiance into a tapestry of enduring control. And in that moment, she felt the transformation begin, subtle at first, then undeniable. Curiosity and fear fused into vigilance, passivity transmuted into strategic awareness, and ordinary perception reshaped itself into recognition of patterns, signs, and codes invisible to the uninitiated. The man beneath the soil was a teacher, his preserved life a demonstration of the continuity and sophistication of these hidden systems, and she understood that she was now part of that continuum, irrevocably linked to knowledge that demanded mastery, patience, and courage. Every heartbeat, every subtle breath, every imperceptible twitch was a lesson, and she absorbed it all with the hunger of one who had glimpsed the architecture of existence and could never return to the comfort of ignorance. The forest itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, mirroring the rhythm beneath her hands, as though acknowledging her initiation into truths so dangerous, so forbidden, that civilization itself had conspired to bury them. And as the final tendrils of fear and comprehension intertwined within her mind, she understood the magnitude of the change. She had been awakened, irrevocably, to the mechanisms of power, the preservation of knowledge, and the enduring manipulation of humanity. Fear had become insight, curiosity had become mastery, and she realized with both awe and dread that nothing in her life, or in the world, would ever appear the same. She had descended, fully and willingly, into the forbidden, and there was no path back to ignorance, only the unfolding responsibility of awareness and the haunting weight of forbidden truth. That as she absorbed the rhythm of the pulse beneath her hands, she began to perceive the vast continuum of hidden forces that had silently shaped humanity since its inception. History, she realized, was not a series of chance events or moral lessons. It was a carefully curated narrative, a mechanism of control, with rebellions, revolutions, and empires themselves subtly orchestrated to preserve hierarchy and obedience. Mortality was equally manipulated. Life and death had long been leveraged by elites to maintain dominance, to enforce fear, and to transmit lessons selectively, preserving only what could serve the continuity of power. She could see the patterns woven into every civilization, ritual, law, education, religion, and social structure, all operating in concert, calibrated to guide perception, shape thought, and restrict comprehension. The man beneath the soil was a living testament to this continuum, a demonstration of the sophistication with which knowledge had been hidden, preserved, and, when necessary, weaponized. Each subtle pulse beneath her fingers communicated a lesson that no written text or spoken word could convey, a visceral understanding of influence, manipulation, and survival. And as her mind expanded to integrate these truths, she realized that the world was not merely watched or controlled. It was designed, engineered by intelligence that understood the mechanisms of thought, behavior, and perception with precision that bordered on omniscience. She felt an almost physical resonance with the networks that had orchestrated humanity's development, a chilling awareness that the invisible architects of civilization had anticipated every possibility, shaping not only events but the very consciousness of generations. Fear, once a tool of compliance, had become a teacher, guiding her understanding of power, survival, and the true scope of manipulation. And in this awakening, she recognized the staggering responsibility of insight. Knowledge was no longer theoretical. It was active, dynamic, and irrevocably tied to her awareness. Every decision, every observation, every interaction would now be filtered through the lens of this forbidden comprehension. The forest, the soil, and the pulse beneath her hand seemed to merge into a single consciousness, one that whispered the truths of hidden hierarchies, the subtle orchestration of human history, and the enduring endurance of elites who had mastered both life and perception. She understood, finally, that she had crossed into a domain few ever touched, a realm where knowledge was power, and power was survival, and where the cost of ignorance was nothing short of annihilation, social, psychological, and spiritual, she began to perceive the intricate ways these hidden systems operated not just on societies, but on the individual mind, infiltrating thought, emotion, and instinct with a precision that was terrifying in its subtlety. Every belief she had held, every moral boundary she had trusted, every impulse she had thought her own now appeared as a product of deliberate calibration, the invisible hand of centuries of design guiding her choices without her knowledge. The pulse beneath her hand seemed to encode this understanding, a living demonstration of how perception itself could be manipulated, bending fear, desire, and obedience into a seamless conduit of control. Rituals, education, media, and law, all seemingly benign, were in fact vectors of conditioning, designed to shape the way humans interpreted reality, measured loyalty, and assigned value. She realized that this preservation, this unnaturally sustained life, was both a symbol and an instrument, showing how elites and hidden networks maintained influence by embedding patterns of compliance, expectation, and interpretation deep into the human psyche. And as her awareness deepened, she could sense the subtle corrections these forces applied, nudges and reinforcements so faint they were nearly imperceptible, yet potent enough to guide entire populations, maintain hierarchy, and suppress rebellion. The forest around us seemed to pulse in resonance with the hidden patterns, each leaf, shadow, and rustle a metaphor for the precision with which human behavior had been calibrated. She felt herself absorbing the mechanics of influence, understanding that fear was a tool, belief a lever, and knowledge a weapon. And with each revelation, she felt the irreversible impact on her own consciousness. Decisions that had once seemed instinctive now appeared as the results of unseen pressures, of subtle designs that had orchestrated her understanding of right and wrong, possible and impossible. The preserved life beneath her fingers was a mirror and a guide, teaching her how influence endured across centuries, survived generations, and encoded itself into the very structure of thought. She shivered, knowing that this awareness was both gift and curse. She could now see the hidden machinery shaping herself and every person around her, and with that vision came responsibility, danger, and the haunting realization that ignorance was no longer an option. She had stepped into a world where perception was power, and the cost of awakening was the permanent dissolution of ordinary reality. With each heartbeat she felt beneath her hands, she sensed a shift within herself, a transformation from passive observer into someone capable of perceiving and navigating the hidden currents of power that governed the world. The forbidden knowledge she had absorbed was no longer abstract. It was operational, a toolkit for anticipating influence, decoding manipulation, and reclaiming agency within systems designed to suppress it. She understood that every social cue, every law, every moral expectation could be read, interpreted, and even leveraged, once one recognized the architecture behind it. The pulse beneath her fingers was a living testament to the continuity of these techniques, a demonstration of how knowledge could endure, guide, and instruct even across centuries of secrecy and death. And as she aligned her perception with this rhythm, she felt a clarity unlike anything she had known. Fear became insight, uncertainty transformed into strategic awareness, and every instinct she had once relied upon was now sharpened by understanding. She began to perceive how obedience had been cultivated in every generation, how human cognition had been subtly steered to normalize hierarchy, ritual, and submission, and how, with this awareness, she could navigate, anticipate, and even manipulate these forces for survival and mastery. The forest seemed alive with subtle signals, echoes of the same intelligence that had preserved him beneath the soil, and she realized that she was now part of the continuum, a participant in a legacy of hidden knowledge, initiated and empowered by the forbidden. Each breath she drew carried both caution and exhilaration, a recognition that insight without vigilance was dangerous, but mastery offered unparalleled advantage. She felt the boundaries of reality expand, understanding that the very fabric of life, death, and perception was flexible when approached with awareness, patience, and courage. And as her consciousness intertwined with the pulse of preserved life, she knew that the descent had reached a point of irreversible transformation. She was no longer just witnessing history, secrecy, or control. She had internalized it, activated it within herself, and now possessed the capacity to operate within, anticipate, and manipulate the hidden systems that had guided humanity silently for millennia. Knowledge, she realized, was now power incarnate, and she could never return to unawareness. The forbidden had become part of her, She could feel the enormity of the hidden currents that had shaped not just individuals, but entire civilizations, flowing through her awareness like a living map of power, influence, and consequence. Empires, revolutions, wars, and peace treaties were no longer isolated events. They were orchestrated moments, aligned by invisible hands, calibrated to maintain hierarchy, suppress dangerous knowledge, and preserve the continuity of control. Every law, every moral code, every social expectation was now legible to her as a vector of influence, a deliberate mechanism to guide perception and behavior. She understood that destiny itself had been engineered, that human history was not merely the accumulation of chance or choice, but the careful choreography of elites, secret networks, and hidden systems operating beyond observation. And the man beneath her hands, preserved, conscious, and resilient, was a living artifact of this continuum, a demonstration of the lengths to which knowledge would be protected, the intelligence that endured in secrecy, and the patience required to maintain dominion across centuries. She could sense the subtle interweaving of fear, desire, loyalty, and obedience, calibrated over generations, each pulse beneath her fingertips echoing lessons in control, preservation, and the perpetuation of influence. With this awareness came a profound understanding of mortality. Life and death were not absolutes but tools, orchestrated to convey lessons, enforce hierarchy, and encode knowledge selectively. She felt the responsibility of insight pressing into her consciousness, the understanding that the machinery she now perceived was active, pervasive, and dynamic, shaping not only the world outside, but the thoughts, perceptions, and decisions of every living mind within it. And yet, amid the weight of revelation, a strange exhilaration surged through her. She was no longer blind to the hidden forces, no longer a passive participant in the design of civilization. She had been awakened, irrevocably, and with that awakening came agency, strategy, and the capacity to navigate, influence, and master the continuum of power. The pulse beneath her hands became both anchor and compass, guiding her understanding of the architecture of control, the rhythm of manipulation, and the subtle orchestration of human destiny. And she knew, with absolute clarity, that once the forbidden is seen, once the machinery of civilization is understood, ignorance is impossible, and the world becomes simultaneously more dangerous, more malleable, and infinitely more alive. She felt the full weight of her initiation settling into her bones, a slow, inescapable awareness that the world she had known had been a carefully constructed illusion, and that her life would never return to its former simplicity. The pulse beneath her hands was no longer just a signal of preserved life. It was a summons, a declaration that she had been irrevocably inducted into the hidden architecture of power, corruption, and control. Every instinct, every perception, every decision she had once trusted now existed in the context of this forbidden knowledge, and she could no longer ignore the subtle manipulations embedded in every institution, every relationship, every law. She realized that the costs of awareness were profound. Fear became sharper, responsibility heavier, and the solitude of understanding more acute, because few could comprehend what she now knew without being destroyed by it. And yet, within that gravity, she felt an intoxicating sense of empowerment. Insight had become a weapon, perception a tool, and the hidden rhythms of life and influence were now legible to her mind. She saw the consequences of centuries of secrecy, the calculated endurance of knowledge preserved against oblivion, and the subtle ways elites had manipulated entire populations without detection, bending morality, belief, and even memory to maintain dominance. The preserved man beneath her hands was both a teacher and a warning, a living testament to the sophistication of control, the lengths required to sustain it, and the transformative power of awakening to its reality. And as she internalized the pulse, the breath, the faint movements that had once seemed impossible, she understood the permanence of her descent. She had crossed the threshold of ordinary perception, and there was no returning. The world now existed in layers she could not unsee, patterns she could not ignore, and hierarchies she could not unlearn. Fear had been transmuted into vigilance, confusion into strategic awareness, and ignorance into an impossibility. She was now part of the continuum, an active participant in the hidden systems that had shaped human history, and with that realization came both exhilaration and dread. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her, as though recognizing that she had become both witness and inheritor, a custodian of knowledge too dangerous to remain hidden, and a mind forever altered by the forbidden truths that pulsed beneath the soil. She could feel the forbidden knowledge settling into every fiber of her being, a presence so potent that it reshaped thought, instinct, and perception simultaneously, leaving no room for the person she had been before. The pulse beneath her hands had become an extension of her awareness, a living guide threading her consciousness into the continuum of power, secrecy, and control that had endured for centuries. Every hidden hierarchy, every subtle manipulation, every calculated act of obedience she had once dismissed now appeared with startling clarity, laid bare as part of a deliberate architecture of influence. She realized that understanding these systems was not a passive act. It was transformative, an initiation that permanently altered identity, cognition, and the very way she would perceive reality. Fear and reverence intertwined, but they were now allies, sharpening intuition, enhancing comprehension, and allowing her to navigate a world constructed to obscure the truth from ordinary eyes. She understood that the pulse beneath her hands was more than life. It was intelligence, strategy, and a conduit for knowledge that had survived because it was too dangerous to die. Every subtle movement, every heartbeat, every rhythm carried lessons on dominance, survival, and the preservation of forbidden truths, and as she absorbed them, she felt her mind expand to contain what humanity had long been shielded from. Her perception of morality, power, and reality itself shifted. The boundaries between life and death, obedience and free will, knowledge and ignorance blurred, revealing a deeper truth. Control was real, knowledge was lethal, and awareness was both weapon and responsibility. She felt the continuity of ancient elites, the enduring mechanisms of influence, and the invisible forces that had guided human history for millennia, and she understood that her awakening was not accidental. It was deliberate, orchestrated by the universe of hidden patterns she was now attuned to, aligning her mind with the pulse of intelligence that had endured beneath the soil. And in that realization, exhilaration and dread coalesced. She was no longer merely an observer. She was part of the continuum, a custodian of forbidden knowledge, and her identity had been irreversibly transformed. The descent had reached its zenith, and the world she once knew had dissolved into layers of hidden truth, subtle manipulation, and the enduring rhythm of secrets that could kill, teach, and empower all at once. Today, as she withdrew her hands, the pulse beneath them did not fade. It lingered, a tether connecting her consciousness to a continuum older than memory, a rhythm that would forever echo in her thoughts, her decisions, and her perception of reality. She realized, with a mixture of awe and dread, that she had become inseparable from the hidden architectures of power, secrecy, and influence that had shaped civilizations, orchestrated obedience, and preserved knowledge through faith, ritual, and patience. The man beneath the soil was no longer merely an anomaly. He was a teacher, a guide, a living testament to the sophistication of control, and she had become his heir, absorbing the mechanisms that allowed life, death, and perception to be manipulated with precision. Every instinct she had once relied upon was now sharpened, every perception reframed, every decision filtered through the lens of forbidden understanding. She understood that life itself had been a carefully constructed illusion, morality a malleable tool, and ignorance a weapon wielded to preserve hierarchy. And yet, within the terrifying clarity of her awakening, there was power, the capacity to see, anticipate, and navigate forces invisible to ordinary minds, to operate within the networks of influence that had silently guided humanity for millennia, and to survive where ignorance would have destroyed her. The forest seemed still, almost reverent, as if recognizing that she had crossed the final threshold, irrevocably initiated into truths that few could endure, and fewer could wield without being consumed. She felt the pulse in her own chest now, in sync with the rhythm beneath the soil, a reminder that the continuum of knowledge, control, and survival was alive within her, permanent and unyielding. Fear had become comprehension, dread had become mastery, and ignorance was no longer possible. And as she stood, forever altered, she understood the haunting magnitude of what she had uncovered. She was no longer simply a witness to forbidden life. She was part of it, a custodian of secrets that could bend reality, reshape perception, and endure across centuries. The descent was complete. The forbidden was hers, and with it came the solemn, inescapable truth. Once the hidden pulse of power and knowledge touches the mind, the world is never the same, and neither is the man who dares to listen.